Think about the hand you use to write, the hand you use to eat, the hand you instinctively reach out with when you need to grab something. You probably never chose it. You just started using it, but here's the strange part. Your brain may have been leaning toward that choice before you were even born, and once that preference develops, changing it isn't nearly as simple as deciding to use the other hand. Today, about 9 out of every 10 people are right-handed. Only around 1 in 10 are left-handed, and that ratio isn't some modern coincidence. Evidence from ancient human remains suggests that this preference goes incredibly far back in our evolutionary history. But why? Why did humans become so heavily biased toward one hand? And perhaps even more interesting, why didn't evolution simply get rid of left-handed people? Let's go back, way back, before writing, before cities, before agriculture, before civilization as we know it. Scientists have found clues hidden in something surprisingly ordinary. Teeth around 130,000 years ago, a Neanderthal was using a sharp stone tool to work on an animal hide. The hide had to be held tightly, so the Neanderthal used their teeth to grip it while pulling the material with one hand and scraping it with the other occasionally. The tool slipped, and when it did, it left tiny marks on the teeth. Those marks can reveal the direction in which the tool was moving, and therefore give researchers clues about which hand was doing the work. And the fascinating thing is that similar evidence appears again and again in ancient humans. Even much older human relatives show patterns suggesting a strong preference for the right hand, so this isn't something humans invented recently. Our ancestors were already showing handedness long before anyone had written down a single word. But here's where things get even more interesting. You might assume handedness is simply genetic. Parents are right-handed, their child becomes right-handed, end of story. Not quite. Identical twins are one of the best clues. They can have essentially the same DNA, and yet one twin can be right-handed while the other is left-handed. So genes matter, but genes don't completely determine the answer. Instead, researchers think handedness comes from a complicated combination of genetics, brain development, and chance. In other words, your DNA may load the dice, but it doesn't necessarily decide the final role. And this brings us to the brain. Your brain is divided into 2 major hemispheres, and each hemisphere has strong connections to the opposite side of your body. The left hemisphere controls much of the right side. The right hemisphere controls much of the left. For most right-handed people, language is also strongly concentrated in the left hemisphere. That creates an interesting connection. The same side of the brain that is heavily involved in language is also deeply involved in controlling the dominant right hand. And researchers have found connections between brain regions involved in language and those involved in planning and using tools, so somewhere during human evolution, several important abilities may have become organized around the same side of the brain: speaking, controlling the hand, using tools, planning precise movements, and once that organization became common, the right hand became the dominant hand for most humans. But then comes the biggest mystery. If right-handedness is so common, why are left-handers still here? You might think evolution would slowly eliminate them, but evolution doesn't always work that way. Sometimes being different can actually be useful, and one of the best examples comes from sports. Imagine 2 fighters. One has spent their entire career practicing against right-handed opponents. Their brain expects certain movements, certain angles, certain positions. Then suddenly they face a left-handed opponent. Everything is reversed. The punches come from unfamiliar angles. The stance looks different. The timing feels different. And that tiny moment of confusion can matter enormously in a fast competition. That's why left-handed athletes have sometimes been found at surprisingly high rates in sports involving direct competition: boxing, fencing, tennis, cricket, and other one-on-one sports. The advantage isn't necessarily that left-handers are stronger or faster. It's that they are unusual. Most people train against the majority, so the majority becomes very good at dealing with the majority. But when something rare appears, the brain has less experience handling it, and that creates an advantage. Think about it this way: if everyone were left-handed, being left-handed wouldn't be surprising anymore. The advantage would disappear, so being rare can sometimes be useful. and this may help explain why left-handedness has survived generation after generation, but there's a catch, because being left-handed isn't always an advantage. In many everyday situations, the world is designed around right-handed people. Scissors, desk tools, musical instruments, sports equipment. Even simple objects can feel slightly awkward when they're designed for the opposite hand. So left-handers can gain an advantage in direct competition, while sometimes facing disadvantages when they're using equipment designed for the majority. It's almost like evolution found a compromise. Too many left-handers, and their competitive advantage becomes less special. Too few, and the variation doesn't disappear completely. The result, a surprisingly stable minority around 10%. But there may be another fascinating difference. The brains of left-handed people can show slightly different patterns of organization. For many right-handed people, certain abilities are strongly concentrated in one hemisphere. Left-handed people are more likely to show activity distributed across both hemispheres. That doesn't mean left-handers have some magical superbrain. They don't, but their brains can organize certain functions somewhat differently. And that difference may sometimes help the brain adapt when one region is damaged, because the opposite hemisphere may already be involved in the same function. So being left-handed isn't a defect, it isn't a mistake, and it certainly isn't something the brain simply got wrong. In fact, humanity spent a surprisingly long time treating it that way. Even the language we use carries traces of this old bias. The Latin word sinister originally meant left. Today we associate it with something threatening or evil. The French word gauche means left, but it also came to mean awkward or clumsy, and in English the word right can mean both a direction and something that is correct. For centuries, many children who naturally preferred their left hand were forced to switch. Teachers and parents tried to train them into using their right hand, but handedness isn't simply a habit you picked up because someone taught you to write that way. The preference is deeply connected to how your brain organizes movement. Your dominant hand isn't just the hand you happen to like. It is part of a much older biological pattern, a pattern that existed long before schools, long before books, and probably long before humans even had language. So the next time you pick up your phone, write your name, throw a ball, or reach for something without thinking, remember this: you're using a preference that your species has carried for an incredibly long time. Your hand feels ordinary, but the story behind it is anything but ordinary. And if you're left-handed, you might just be carrying one of evolution's oldest examples of being different without being wrong.